Hello, everyone. So, we're going to really dive deep on the witch wound. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail in a second around what it is and how it works, but I really think it's crucial. Like, I can give you all the best business content in the world, right? We can go out there and we can build the best products and do really good marketing and even really good sales. But if we're not integrated within ourselves, particularly around this topic, then it's going to be really scary and difficult for us to put ourselves out there. You can write a great ad, but if you're too afraid to hit upload or hit send on the ad, right, then that's going to become an issue really quickly. So what we're going to cover today, we're going to look at the witch wound, what it is. We're going to look at it through a couple of different lenses because I think I hear people talk about it a lot in a historical context and a social context, but there's also the personal context to this as well that I think is really important, the way it ties into past lives and callings and things like that. We're going to talk a bit about your story, and then I will assign homework as I am wont to do. So let's talk about healing the witch wound. This is part one. Firstly, what is the witch wound? So you have probably noticed, in the same way that I have noticed, that women can be quite terrified of putting themselves out there. And there's a lot of different reasons for that, right? And if you go into corporate environments, they love to have these conversations that are all around all around women just need to be more confident. And I was like, cool, but I don't think confidence is always the issue. I'm not saying women could never be more confident. Of course, that can be an issue, but also think we have to dig into why those women aren't confident, because it doesn't tend to happen in a vacuum. For every woman who's like not particularly confident, there tends to be like a brother or something who's like very confident. So where is that coming from? So what is the witch wound? The witch wound really underpins a lot of the sort of social stuff that we have going on as women. It is a deep memory, and we're going to look at the different ways that memory comes through: past life, genetic. There's also the social and historical context to it, right? Like, we know that women have been murdered, and it happens all the time, even now, right? How many women this year for existing? Just for putting themselves out there, for being present or visible. And so it's very much about which is this label. You've probably heard me say, which has always been a code word for women that society wants to control. And the witch wound is the ways in which have been able to control it. We're going to dig a lot deeper into that throughout this video. We're going to look at it through several different lenses because I think there's a lot to it. So the different lenses we're going to look at it through, is the historical lens. And as we go through and as we talk about each lens, I think you'll get a firmer understanding of what wound looks like in the first place and how it relates specifically to you. Historical, social, and personal. And look, I use this photo here intentionally. So this photo here is a photo from, there's a festival in Italy, and it still happens every year, where they make an effigy of a witch and they burn her. It still happens. You guys know we've had problems with venues for witch school, right? Because you use the word witch and people become triggered because it still happens. The terror associated with the witch wound isn't just about calling yourself a witch. And I think that's an important distinction to make. Although absolutely that is huge and makes it very difficult to own that word witch. But it's also the terror that's associated with existing in the world as a woman. It's very much what a witch wound is. And you've probably heard me say, and I'll repeat it for those of you who haven't, and you will definitely hear me say a lot, that I encourage all women to use the word witch, even if it's not necessarily their spiritual path or their spiritual practice. It's a word that I encourage women to use because of the historical, social, and feminist context, the ways in which it's being used. I like, let's face it, if we go back, and we're about to talk about the historical context, maybe we switch to that. If we go back 3,000 years, we didn't call ourselves witches. Wise women didn't call themselves witches. This is a word we're using as a reclamation. It's a word that was used against us. It's how we were painted, and it's a word we're taking back and owning and making it a positive instead of a negative. Let's talk about the heuristical? Heuristical. Heurist. Oh, this is where I am right now. The word was historical. I'm not even going to cut that out, though. It's heuristical. The historical we've got to laugh when we're talking about this stuff, otherwise we'll go crazy. The historical context of the witch wound, because it's very intimately tied to the burning times. So there was this era where, I'm going to call it the Inquisition. It's fascinating to me is that so often when we start talking about witches and what was done to them, Salem comes up. And honestly, the witch hysteria in Salem was literally, allow me to decline that, was literally like 3 or 4 women who got murdered. But I think because Arthur Miller made the Crucible and stuff, it's a lot more top of mind for people. Whereas a lot more women died in Europe. The Inquisition was hundreds of years long, and a lot of women were murdered in a lot of horrible ways. We don't have exact numbers. There was no real records kept at the time, but it was, and the estimates are anywhere from 250,000 at the low end to the high end. I've heard 9 million. So either way, it was a massive number of women who were murdered for the crime of existing. Some of these women would have been healers and midwives. Yeah, some of them would have been women living on the outskirts of society. But I think something really important to remember is that as a woman who was accused of witchcraft, if you were found guilty and you were put to death, all of your property was forfeit to the Catholic Church. So a lot of women put to death were outspoken women, women who were just, especially as the hysteria reached a peak, right? There was a lot going on that was just people accusing each other just to get rid of people they didn't like, but also accusing rich women, widows, people with money, because the Catholic Church wanted that. They wanted that cash, brah. It's an interesting thing. Like, if you want to really dig into the history of this, you guys have all got access to Witch Academy, which goes into a lot of detail around this. I personally think that every witch should take the time to at least attempt to read the Malleus Maleficarum. That was the handbook. It's the Hammer of the Witches. It was the handbook that was used to prosecute witches. And I think what's really fascinating about it, and a thing to remember, particularly as we're talking about this topic of the witch wound, is that if you read the Malleus Maleficarum, you have to read a translated version because the original's either Latin or German. It wasn't really like, finding a witch had nothing to do with demons, and it had nothing to do with the devil and all of this sort of stuff. It had to do with a woman's sexuality. And the entire game was, is she having sex? Is she enjoying sex? Because if those things are true, then she's definitely a witch. We must burn her. So, written by a Catholic priest. And so I think that's a really important touch point to remember here. Yeah, the suppression of women's sexuality, the concept of original sin, this all is tied into the witch wound as well. These are all things where if you show yourself to be too sexual, if we're not modest enough, yeah. It's why early versions, I think, of feminism, as women were trying to liberate themselves, were often very anti-sex and very anti-sexuality, but that was really playing into this patriarchal game of what women are supposed to be like. And it still played into this underlying, there's just so much underlying terror around women's sexuality. And that is a large part of where the witch wound comes from. So if that's something that you find you have an issue with, that can absolutely be a part of your witch wound. Historically, there's a really interesting crossover period of time that the Inquisition lands in, because I think sometimes we think of the world, and especially because we have BC AD, right, like before Christ, after death, and we split up time based on Jesus. And because of that, I think sometimes it's really easy to forget that Christianity, it wasn't like Jesus died. Like, we're going to assume, for the sake of this argument, that Jesus was a real historical figure and the timelines are correct, which is a bit of a push, but let's assume they are. I think we forget that it wasn't like Jesus died and then suddenly there was Christianity and the Catholic Church took over. There was a long period, hundreds of years there, 6, 7, 800 years, where Christianity, Catholicism was establishing itself, where the Catholic Church was taking over. You had the kind of declining Roman Empire, but the Catholic Church coming in there and then spreading throughout the Roman Empire and into a lot of places that were pagan, right? But the last pagan church that they closed was actually the Church of Isis. There were still priestesses worshipping in Philae, Isis's sacred island, right up to, I think, it was either 600 or 900, but I think 600 AD. So it's actually quite a long timeline before this stuff came in. But if you really look at it, this coincides with the way in which women are treated, right? So there's an absolute crossover between women no longer being able to hold positions of power, because throughout ancient Egypt, you had multiple pharaohs who were women. You had a lot of societies that were more tribal and had more matriarchal leadership. You certainly had places in which, even if women weren't necessarily maybe the leaders of the tribe, they were respected as healers and elders and stuff in their own right. So it was a very different place. And then we brought in this religion, the Abrahamic traditions, which were there is a male God, there is a male son of God, and there are male angels, and women are over here, but they're not gods, they're humans, and they're relegated to being either the mothers of God or prostitutes, which is also, by the way, if you don't know this and you haven't read into it, Mary Magdalene is not a prostitute, was not a prostitute. That was something that a priest said, again, about 600 AD, not a priest, a pope said in 600 AD, and it was picked up and repeated ad infinitum to this day, but it was actually never true. There is nowhere ever listed that she was a prostitute. It was just their way of running her down, because she was actually the first one to go out and preach the same things that Jesus was saying after he died. And of course they wanted to run her down, because the entirety of that patriarchal tradition relies on women being under the heel. So you can see historically, yeah, this witch wound has been this subjugation of women. And we historically know it, right? We know these things happened. We're aware of the Inquisition, even if we're not, maybe everybody hasn't read quite as much stuff about it. You know it's there. And I think this is an important thing to remember, because we'll talk about the past life context and the actual genetic memory as well, which come under our sort of personal stuff, because I think that's a part of it too. But you also have to remember that if we just deal with right now in this life, we all learned about these things. We know that they happened, and we know that to an extent they're still happening, which is our next lens we're going to look at. And these things impact us. We know there's a history of how women were treated. We know there's a history of us being burned at the stake, hanged, a lot of really other horrific tortures that were visited upon women for the crime of existing, but not just of existing, but of standing out in any way, of being different in any way, of being different in any way. And I think that's a really important and crucial element for us to take into account when we're asking ourselves where we want to go with our businesses, what we want to grow, and when we look at our fear about putting ourselves out publicly, because we all have it, how much of that comes back to this? Yeah. Let's look at the social side of it. So when we're talking social, I mean now, the things that are happening now. Some of you guys will have heard this story, but I'll tell it anyway, because I like stories. I was at a women's event in 2019. It was a women's conference, and like an event with a lot of very successful, way more successful than me, women in the room, women whose companies were doing 5 million, 20 million. One woman in that room, Australian woman whose companies do $1 billion. Like she's like on the BRW rich list. And she was in this room actually for this event, for this particular workshop that we went into. So we went into this workshop, and it was ostensibly about how women can get more press and more funding. And there were two men leading it. And they sat there, and for about 20 minutes, they just went on about how women need to be more confident and they need to put themselves out there more. And women need to be more confident and they need to put themselves out there more. And eventually I put my hand up because I got sick of this. And I said, hey, look, here's the thing. I hear what you're saying, and you're not entirely wrong. I absolutely believe there's an element of women needing to be more confident. However, it is intellectually dishonest to have this conversation without also discussing the very serious and real consequences that women do face for being visible. Yeah, because I've had more than my share of death and rape threats online. To be fair, and let me say this as I said to them, as I'll say to you, that it was in an incredibly male dominated industry. That's when I was working in internet marketing. It was incredibly male dominated, and there are a lot of men, and not even like male dominated, the kind of incel bros who worship like Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan, like those guys, right? So the really misogynistic, really specifically misogynistic. This is the industry that brought you The Game by Neil Strauss, right? The whole pickup artist community, it all started here. So not just male dominated, but dominated by a very particular kind of man. And so it was pretty horrific, the kind of stuff that I would receive from people. And I shared that in the room because I was like, it's fine to say that women need to be more confident, but the world fucking hates a confident woman. The world hates us for being confident. Yeah. The world wants you to be sexualized, yeah, objectified, but never to own your own sexuality or to like yourself. Yeah, especially like your physical appearance. If you like your physical appearance, you're vain. Yeah, but if you can't, if you don't allow people to objectify you, then you're no fun. The real like social structure that we live in is hugely problematic, and we're still fighting this fucking fight all of these decades later. How is it still possible? But I think this social context is really important. We still, which we're in part number two, we still face the potentiality of violence and murder, whether it's intimate partner violence. I have had clients on more than one occasion in my programs, women who have done very well financially and who have then had huge issues in their relationship as a result. I'm not going to say violence because I don't know that for certain, but certainly situations where they had to stop making so much money because their partner was upset. We actually know that when a woman out earns a man, the likelihood of domestic violence goes up by 30%. Which is just terrifying. It's terrifying. But this is still very much the world that we live in. So there's still this message following on from the historical message, right? There is still this message that we live with every day. And every time you see somebody spouting Jordan Peterson shit on the internet, or every time you see somebody, always a response to, especially in the US, when you see mass murders by these incel guys, and there's questions about whether forced monogamy would stop it. Do you know what? Women are still treated as both the victim and the aggressor, like it's our fault in these situations. We're still being burned as witches. We're still being put in this place of being, well, we magically seduced a man and it's our fault, and these terrible things are still happening, and we carry this with us. We see it online, we see it on TV, we see it in fiction, we see it in nonfiction. Like, it's still there and we can't escape it. And when you find that you're holding yourself back from really putting yourself out there, is it just confidence? Is it? Because there's a lot of things that can happen to women when they're visible. The third part, and I think probably the most important in all of this, I really feel like the historical and the social context are important, but they are the ancillary, the foundational. Yeah, what really gets us and what allows some of us to break out of it and others to get stuck in it is the personal element to this. So there's multiple elements to the personal element, right? There is the sort of the how we personally take the social and the historical. There is our personal circumstances growing up, so the kind of parents we had and their understanding and thoughts around gender roles as a part of it, but other things as well. But I also think that there's that meme that does the rounds that's where the granddaughters of the witches that you couldn't burn. Like, that has a real thing. There's a lot of evidence now. For starters, we know that women, because women are born with all of the eggs that they will ever have, there's this genetic line that goes back through the mother, the grandmother, right? That your mother was carrying you when your grandmother was pregnant with her. So that genetic material, the genetic memory, the DNA coding, like that is all there. And you wonder, and there is a lot of research being done now about how trauma impacts, and what's more traumatic than having been like murdered. So there's this real potential ancestral memory that goes back even beyond your grandmother, right? Like back and back. And this trauma can be carried through the genetics. So there's this part of it. There's the very real memories and encoded trauma in your DNA of the women in your history who were persecuted for things. Then there's past life memory. And I think this is a bit that like doesn't get talked about enough with the witch wound, because we're not just the daughters of the witches or the granddaughters of the witches you couldn't burn. We're also the souls of the ones that you did. And I have a very strong belief that women who are called to this work right now, right? Women who have been called, who know this is what they're supposed to be doing, that they have a past life. And normally, always when we dig into it, they have a past life where they were abandoned, betrayed, murdered for practicing in some way. Maybe they were healers, maybe they were wise women, shamans in their tribes. But I have a strong belief in that. And when you get a chance to come and do a retreat with me, we will do some past life regression stuff, and we'll tap into that if you want to, if you're prepared for it. We'll tap into that and we'll look for those like past life wounds. But in terms of the now, because I think we can deal with past life stuff later, I always say, let's deal with the now stuff first, right? Let's get that under control first, right? So here's how we're going to do it. How do you identify your witch wound? How do you figure out what parts of these elements make up your stuff? Look, it's complex because you're complex, right? Personality is made up of so many different things, and there's so many things that impact it. But the best way that I can think of to do this as a start point is simply to begin by writing your story. And when I say that, I really mean thinking about the things that you heard when you were young, probably. So, how we know about the way the human brain develops, right? Between the ages of 0 and 6, we are data collection machines. We're just looking around us, we're collecting all the data, we're seeing all these things happening, we're seeing how parents behave and how other people behave. You say something and the person reacts. Like, we're collecting all this data. Between the ages of 6 and 9, we make up stories about what that data means, yeah, or adopt other people's stories. It's not just the stories we make up, we can adopt other people's stories as well. So, really, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for this period between the ages of 6 and 9, right, where you developed a lot of the stories that you now live with. We've talked about how your thoughts aren't true. This is where they came from. What I want you to think about is what was going on for you. And really, I think a good way to approach this is to start by writing down, like, where were you living? What school were you going to? What grade were you in? Yeah, you were 6, 7, 8, 9 years old. What grade were you in? What was going to school like for you? Yeah, I got bullied really badly, so it was rough for me. What were the things you were interested in? What were you drawn to? Witchcraft was such a thing for me. I was so already 100% there, right? What were you drawn to? But also, what were the things that you heard about yourself? Did you hear that you were too much? I got that a lot. That you were too much, that you needed to be quiet, that you needed to calm down. Did you hear that you weren't enough? Were you compared to maybe a sister or a cousin or a friend, other girls in your class? Yeah. This is where you're going to start to find and pick out those stories, because for me, like I said, this personal stuff, your story, this is the foundation on which everything else lies. Because the things that we understand about, or we've learned about the Inquisition or about social structures, that's all piled on top of this foundation of how we've been taught to think about ourselves. Deconstructing that part first allows us to break these other bits. So that's your homework. Yeah, that's your homework. I simply want you to write your story between the ages of 6 and 9. You can just do it as dot points if you like. If you like to write and you like to write a story, you can do it in the first person or the third person. You can make it like a proper story. Like, however you want to do it, I'm fine. The point here is really about not about how good the writing is or how well you tell a story. The point here is really about digging into why you feel the way you do about things, because that witch wound is layered on top of those personal wounds. Yeah. That fear, the witch wound really is the fear of being visible. And as long as you're terrified of being visible, you cannot do the work you were put on earth to do. Now, I'm not saying you need to want to be like on TV or in front of millions of people or anything like that. Honestly, I think I've watched people go through that, and I think it's actually intensely destructive. Certainly not a goal of mine. But understanding what holds you back from putting yourself out there, what holds you back from speaking up. Yeah, and we have the historical context and we have the social context, but all of that is most important when layered on top of the personal context. So, write your story for me.